Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
The wind whispered over the mountains, curling through the dark pines and scattering soft flakes of snow across the narrow road. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the land dressed in white, and beneath the stillness, the faint crunch of footsteps echoed. Lena pulled her coat tighter around her and adjusted the strap of her old leather bag. Her breath came out in slow clouds that shimmered briefly before vanishing into the air. The sun had already begun to set, dipping behind the jagged peaks of Colorado's high country, and the sky was painted in strokes of violet and silver. She had been walking for nearly an hour, following a trail that wound between trees heavy with snow. Somewhere ahead, she knew, stood the cabin her grandfather had told her about, a place she had never seen, but had felt drawn to ever since she was a child. The path narrowed, winding down toward a frozen stream. The snow crunched under her boots, steady and rhythmic. Every now and then, the quiet was interrupted by the groan of a branch releasing its burden of snow or the distant call of a raven. The world was vast and empty, yet there was comfort in its solitude. The kind of peace that only comes when the noise of everything else has fallen away. As she crossed the stream, she saw it at last, a faint plume of smoke curling up through the trees. The cabin stood at the base of a ridge, half hidden by pine and drifted snow. Its roof sagged under years of weather, but the windows glowed with a soft amber light that flickered gently through the falling dusk. It looked almost as though it had been waiting for her. When she reached the porch, she paused, brushing the snow from her coat. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine sap. She knocked once, lightly, not expecting an answer. None came. Slowly, she pushed open the door. Inside, the warmth was immediate, a deep, living heat that seemed to reach out and wrap around her. The fire in the stone hearth was burning low but steady, casting its golden light across the wooden floor. The cabin was simple, built from logs darkened by age. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, candles, and jars of preserved fruit. A heavy wool blanket was draped over an armchair beside the fire, and above the mantel hung an old photograph, a man and woman standing in front of the cabin, smiling as the snow fell around them. Lena stepped closer, brushing her fingers along the frame. The man was her grandfather, younger, his face full of the warmth she remembered. The woman beside him, she recognized from stories, was her grandmother, the one who had passed before Lena was born. For a moment, the firelight seemed to flicker brighter, as if acknowledging her presence. She took off her gloves and sat in the armchair. The fabric was worn but soft, the kind of chair that remembered every person who had ever rested there. The flames whispered, and the wind outside hummed faintly against the windows. Lena closed her eyes, feeling her heartbeat slow. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she opened her eyes again, the fire had dimmed and the world outside had turned silver. Moonlight poured through the frost-kissed glass, painting the room in a quiet glow. The air was still warm, and the only sound was the steady crackle of the last embers. She sat up slowly, her breath catching as she noticed something new, a mug on the table beside her, steaming gently. She hadn't made tea. The scent was of cinnamon and honey, the same her grandfather used to brew on cold mornings. She hesitated, then picked it up, the heat seeping into her palms. It wasn't fear she felt, it was something deeper, something like recognition. As she took a sip, a wave of calm spread through her chest. The fire stirred, and she thought she heard the faint creak of footsteps on the porch. When she opened the door, no one was there. The snow lay untouched, the forest bathed in moonlight. But something had shifted, not outside, but within. She felt it in the air, in the quiet hum that seemed to settle around her like an unseen presence. She whispered softly, "Thank you," though she didn't know to whom. The next morning, the world was white again. The sun rose over the ridge, turning the snow to gold. Lena spent the day exploring the cabin, finding small traces of the people who had once lived there. A worn journal on the shelf, filled with her grandfather's looping handwriting. A music box that still played a slow, haunting tune when wound. A letter tucked beneath a loose floorboard, yellowed with age. It was addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The writing was faint but clear. For the one who comes after us, the one who listens to the wind. This cabin was built not to be lived in, but to be remembered. When the world becomes too loud, return here. The silence will take care of you. And when you hear the creak in the floorboards, don't be afraid, it's only us, still watching, still home. The fire crackled softly behind her as she read it again and again, each word sinking deeper into her heart. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes drifting through the pale air. She placed the letter back where she had found it and closed the floorboard gently. That evening, as the storm thickened, she sat by the window and watched the snow cover the path she had taken. It erased her footprints, smoothed every line, until it looked as though no one had walked there at all. Yet she didn't feel lost. The cabin was warm, and the air hummed with quiet life. As night fell, she built up the fire again, watching the sparks rise and vanish. The sound of the wind outside grew softer, blending with the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. It was a sound she could fall asleep to, steady, ancient, kind. And when her eyes grew heavy, she thought she saw something move by the fire. Not a shadow, but a shimmer like light caught in motion. A hand on the back of the chair, a figure outlined in gold. It was gone in a moment, leaving only warmth in its place. She smiled and whispered, "I found you." Then she slept deeply, peacefully, as the snow fell over the roof, as the fire burned low, as the mountains stood silent in their timeless watch. The cabin didn't need words or company. It simply existed, alive in its quiet way, keeping its promise through the long winter night. The morning light crept gently through the cabin's frost-trimmed windows, turning the air to a pale, golden mist. Lena stirred beneath the thick wool blanket, her body warm, her mind still half-dreaming. For a few moments she lay still, listening to the hush that filled the space, the low crackle of the fire's embers, the faint whisper of wind pressing against the logs, and the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. The world outside was hidden in snow, but inside the cabin, time seemed to have stopped. She rose slowly, her feet sinking into the creaking wooden floor. The air was cool, but not cold. Her breath clouded softly in front of her face as she made her way to the hearth and added another log to the fire. Sparks leapt up in lazy arcs, painting the walls with moving light. She stood there for a moment, watching them fade, then turned to the small table where the cup from last night still sat. The tea was gone, the cup empty and clean. Something about that made her smile. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tight around her shoulders. The snow reached nearly to her knees, but it was soft, powdery, untouched except for a faint trail leading toward the trees. The sky above was a pale blue, the kind that always follows a night of heavy snowfall. She breathed in the sharp air, the scent of pine and distant smoke filling her chest. The stillness was absolute, and yet she could feel life humming beneath it, the forest holding its breath, the earth resting quietly under its white blanket. The trail in the snow intrigued her. It was faint, as though made by someone walking carefully, not wanting to disturb the peace. She followed it slowly, her boots crunching in steady rhythm. It wound through the trees, across a small frozen pond, and ended at a fallen log half buried in snow. There was nothing else there, no tracks leading away, no sign of who or what had come before. Only the silence, deep and endless. She stood for a while, listening. The sound of the wind changed subtly, curling around the trees, carrying with it a faint murmur. It might have been nothing, a trick of the wind, but it sounded almost like a voice. A low, familiar whisper. She turned back toward the cabin, her pulse steady, not afraid, just aware. When she returned, the fire had burned higher, as if someone had tended it in her absence. She warmed her hands, then noticed a new object on the mantel, a small wooden carving of a pine cone. The details were delicate, almost too fine for a machine or a quick hand to have made. Her grandfather had been known for his carvings. The shape of this one, the curve of the lines, the way the grain followed the form, it was his work. She was certain of it. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, the smooth finish under her fingers. The firelight flickered, and in that soft glow, she felt the faintest pulse of warmth from the wood itself. She set it down gently, whispering a quiet thank you into the air, and went to the window. The day passed quietly. She spent it exploring, opening the drawers, touching the old tools, the little relics of a life long gone. There were sketches of furniture designs in a leather notebook, recipes in her grandmother's handwriting, a stack of postcards from places her grandparents had once dreamed of visiting. Each object told a story without needing words, and each story wrapped around her like a blanket. By evening, the wind began to rise again. The snow fell harder, brushing against the windows in soft waves. Lena made soup on the old wood stove, the smell of vegetables and herbs filling the small cabin. She sat by the fire and ate slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her body. The light flickered across the walls, making the shadows sway gently like they were alive. She thought about how strange it was that she'd never been here before, never seen this place her grandfather had built, even though she'd heard about it so many times. He had told her stories about it when she was little, about the winters so quiet you could hear snow landing on the roof, about how the cabin knew when you needed rest. He used to say that when life became too loud, this cabin was where the world stopped asking things of you. Now she understood. Outside, the storm deepened, the wind moaning softly through the trees. She watched the flames and let her mind drift. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint hum, a tune, familiar and soothing. It was the melody of an old lullaby, one her grandmother used to sing. The sound wasn't clear, but it moved gently through the air, carried by something unseen. She whispered into the quiet, "I remember." The fire answered with a small pop, the sound sharp but comforting. That night, her dreams were soft and slow, filled with snowlight and laughter. She saw her grandparents sitting by the fire, their faces young, their eyes bright with love. They didn't speak, but she felt everything she needed to: warmth, pride, belonging. When she woke, the cabin was bright with morning light, the world outside still wrapped in snow. Over the next few days, the rhythm of her life fell into something simple, something that felt older than time. She gathered wood, cooked small meals, read by the fire, and sometimes just sat listening to the world breathe. The days were quiet, but never empty. She began to write in her grandfather's journal, not to fill the pages, but to continue them. Each word she wrote felt like a bridge between what was and what remained. There were moments when she caught glimpses, fleeting, gentle ones, of her grandparents' presence. A reflection in the window, a handprint on the frost, the scent of lavender and tobacco that sometimes drifted through the air. It didn't frighten her. It comforted her. It reminded her that love never truly leaves. It simply changes form. One evening, she decided to open the small music box she had found earlier. When she wound it, the melody that played was slow and wistful, the same tune she had heard in her dream. It filled the cabin with a kind of still peace that made the edges of everything blur. The air seemed to shimmer, and she closed her eyes, letting it carry her away. She saw the cabin then, not as it was, but as it had been, alive with voices, laughter, the smell of bread baking, the sound of tools on wood. Her grandfather by the fire, carving something delicate. Her grandmother humming as she stirred a pot on the stove. The scene flickered like candlelight, fading as quickly as it came. When Lena opened her eyes, the music box had stopped. The fire burned low, steady and warm. She smiled through the quiet ache in her chest. It wasn't sadness she felt, but gratitude, a deep, peaceful understanding that she was part of something continuous. The snow outside never stopped for long. It came in waves, soft, patient, unending. Days and nights blurred together, each one softer than the last. The cabin held her gently, asking for nothing. It was as though it knew that this was what she had needed all along, to stop, to listen, to breathe. When she finally decided to leave, it wasn't because she wanted to, it was because she knew she could. The silence had done its work. It had given her back the stillness she'd forgotten she possessed. She packed lightly, leaving behind her coat draped over the chair, her journal on the table, her footprints by the door. Before stepping out, she turned back once more and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." The cabin glowed behind her as she walked away, its chimney breathing smoke into the pale sky. She didn't look back again, but she felt its warmth following her, a steady heartbeat in the cold. Years later, when spring came to the mountains and the snow melted into streams, travelers passing through would sometimes see a thin curl of smoke rising from the old cabin. They'd say it looked inhabited, though no one ever saw anyone there. Some said it was the spirit of the carpenter who built it. Others said it was the echo of a woman's voice singing softly at dusk. But those who stopped and listened carefully, really listened, would hear it for themselves. Not a ghost, not a song, but a kind of calm that settled into their bones. The whisper of a winter cabin that never truly slept, still keeping its quiet promise in the heart of the Colorado mountains. The days passed in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, steady, slow, timeless. Each morning, the first light of dawn would pour softly through the frost-edged windows, spilling over the wooden floorboards like melted gold. The cabin seemed to breathe with her, the wood groaning faintly as it settled, the air alive with warmth from the fire that never quite went out. Lena had stopped counting how long she'd been there. Time had become something she didn't measure anymore. It wasn't a matter of hours or days, but moments, the way snowflakes drifted, the way the kettle whistled before tea, the way her heartbeat slowed whenever she looked out at the mountains blanketed in white. Sometimes she wondered if the world beyond the forest still existed. The phone in her bag had long since lost signal. The roads had disappeared beneath layers of snow. There was a kind of serenity in that, a freedom she hadn't expected. No noise, no demands, no rush. Just the sound of wind brushing the eaves, the fire sighing, and her own breath joining the quiet. At night, the stars glowed brighter than she had ever seen. They shimmered with a clarity that made her chest ache, a kind of beauty that didn't need explanation. She would sit by the window, wrapped in a blanket, her tea steaming beside her, and watch the constellations turn above the black silhouettes of trees. The world outside looked untouched, eternal. And in those still hours, she often felt something near her, not quite visible, not quite real, but familiar, comforting. The presence didn't scare her. It simply existed, like the air or the snow or the memory she carried. Once, as the fire dwindled to embers, she thought she saw movement in the far corner of the cabin. A flicker of light shaped almost like a figure. A man in worn clothes, his outline soft and fading, sitting by the fire with his hands folded. She blinked, and he was gone. Only the empty chair remained, bathed in amber glow. Her heart didn't race. She only smiled, whispering, "Grandpa." The silence that followed was not empty but full of peace, of knowing, of a connection that stretched beyond what could be seen. Every morning, she found something new waiting for her. A freshly carved feather placed on the windowsill, a pine cone neatly arranged beside her journal, or the faint scent of lavender lingering near her pillow. She began to talk to them, the cabin, the unseen hands that seemed to watch over her, her words quiet but sincere. It wasn't madness or imagination. It was trust. The kind of trust that comes from understanding that the world has its own ways of speaking if one only learns how to listen. One afternoon, as the sun sank behind the snow-laden peaks, she decided to walk to the frozen lake. It wasn't far, just beyond the ridge, where the trees parted and the world opened wide. The snow glittered under the fading light, and her breath hung in the air like smoke. The lake lay perfectly still, a mirror of ice reflecting the mountains and sky. She stepped carefully onto its edge, the surface creaking beneath her boots. In the silence, she heard the faint hum again, the same lullaby her grandmother used to hum when she was a child. It seemed to come from beneath the ice, from deep within the frozen water. She knelt and pressed her palm to the surface. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't pull away. Beneath the frozen layer, She thought she saw shadows, shapes moving slowly, gracefully. Not frightening, but gentle, almost human in their movements. The melody grew clearer, wrapping around her like a whisper. It wasn't words, but emotion, warmth, love, memory. She felt tears sting her eyes, though she wasn't sad. She was only full. When she returned to the cabin, she found a folded blanket waiting by the door, one she hadn't brought. It was old but well kept, smelling faintly of cedar. She draped it around her shoulders and sat by the fire again, her body heavy with calm. The storm picked up outside, howling faintly through the chimney, yet inside the walls, the air was soft and safe. The flames danced with lazy grace, and as she watched them, her mind drifted toward the question she'd carried quietly since arriving. Why had she really come here? She had told herself it was for solitude, for peace. But beneath that, there was something deeper, an ache, a longing to reconnect with what she'd lost. The years in the city had blurred her edges, dulled her heart. She had been chasing noise, deadlines, people, motion, until she couldn't hear herself anymore. The cabin wasn't just her grandfather's, it was a piece of her own story calling her back. It was here to remind her of something she had forgotten, the art of stillness, the beauty of silence, the kind of love that lingers even when bodies are gone. Days slipped by like slow-moving rivers. The snow continued to fall, each flake a soft whisper against the roof. She began to write more often, not about events, but feelings. She wrote to the cabin, to her grandparents, to the quiet. Her handwriting grew slower, steadier, each word a breath. She found herself smiling without reason, humming without thought. Sleep came easily, deep and dreamless. It was the kind of rest that healed more than the body, it reached the soul. One night, the fire dimmed to a low orange glow. She woke suddenly, not startled but aware, as if someone had gently called her name. She sat up, and there, by the window, was a faint light, blue and silver, moving like a lantern in the dark. It hovered for a moment, then drifted toward the door, pausing as if to wait. She stood, wrapped her blanket around her, and followed. Outside, the snow was falling lightly, each flake glinting in the moonlight. The light led her through the trees, toward the clearing where the frozen lake lay under a veil of mist. When she reached it, the air was utterly still. The light hung above the ice, pulsing softly. She stepped closer, her boots crunching in the snow. Then, without warning, the light burst, not into sound or fire, but into hundreds of small orbs that floated upward like glowing snow. They rose into the air, forming a path that led toward the stars. She watched, breathless, her heart calm. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't something to explain. It was a gift, the mountain, the cabin, the memories, all coming together in one silent farewell. She whispered, "I understand," and for a moment, she thought she heard two voices whisper back, soft, proud, familiar. The next morning, the sky was clear and blue. The snow sparkled as if dusted with light. The air felt new, as though the whole world had just taken a deep breath. Lena packed her things slowly, touched every object once more, and stood by the hearth. The fire had burned itself out, but warmth lingered in the stones. She left her journal open on the table, her last entry written in calm, deliberate strokes. Peace is not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. She closed the door behind her and began the slow walk down the mountain. The trees watched silently as she passed, their branches heavy with snow. When she turned once, just before the bend, she saw the cabin through the trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin, white, curling gently into the morning sky. Years later, when the snow melted and wildflowers covered the hills, travelers who wandered near the lake would sometimes find small carvings left on the path, feathers, pine cones, and sometimes a heart etched into the bark of a fallen tree. They'd say it was a message from the mountains, a whisper of kindness that calmed even the most restless soul. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was quiet, if you stood by the lake and listened closely, you could still hear it, that soft, distant hum of a lullaby drifting across the water. The song of a winter cabin in Colorado, waiting patiently, watching gently, guarding the dreams of all who had ever needed to rest. The snow continued to fall that evening, endless and patient, a curtain of white draping the world in silence. Lena sat once again by the window, a candle flickering beside her, the wax slowly spilling over the edge of its glass holder. The flame trembled with every soft draft that breathed through the cabin, but it never went out. She had grown to love that little flame, the way it danced without fear, the way it mirrored her own quiet persistence. Outside, the forest was a painting of stillness. Each branch carried the weight of the season, yet nothing ever broke. Everything held. She wrapped her hands around her cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her palms, and listened to the subtle symphony around her. The kettle ticking as it cooled, the wood sighing as it settled, the faint crackle of snowflakes landing on the roof, melting into nothing. It was all so delicate, so perfectly balanced. She realized that for the first time in years, her mind wasn't racing toward the next thing. She wasn't counting the minutes or the days or the things she should be doing. The quiet had undone her urgency, thread by thread, until all that remained was peace. Sometimes she would talk aloud, softly as though to an invisible guest. "You built this place well," she would say, tracing the grain of the table her grandfather had made decades ago. "You must have loved it here." She would imagine his hands rough, steady, carving the wood, mending the roof, gathering stones for the fireplace. Every part of the cabin felt touched by him. The more she stayed, the more she felt like she was living inside a memory, but it wasn't haunting. It was healing. Outside, a fox sometimes crossed the snowfield near the trees, its fur bright against the pale ground. It moved with slow grace, unbothered by her presence. Once, she left a bit of bread by the porch, and the next morning, it was gone, but small paw prints remained. She smiled when she saw them. It felt like the mountain was slowly accepting her, the forest, the wind, the stars, all of it watching and welcoming in quiet ways. On the 5th night after the light had appeared at the lake, the wind rose again. It howled across the ridges and pressed its weight against the cabin walls, but instead of fear, Lena felt a deep calm. She sat by the fire, watching the logs burn to amber ash. The storm outside was fierce, yet she understood now that even storms had their own rhythm, their own kind of music. She could hear it, the deep, steady pulse beneath the noise, like the heartbeat of the mountain. In the middle of that night, she dreamed. The dream felt unlike any other. She was standing outside the cabin, the snow around her glowing faintly as if lit from beneath. The trees were motionless, every branch shimmering like crystal. A figure stood on the edge of the clearing, tall, blurred by light. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. The way you know a scent or a voice before it speaks. Her grandfather. He lifted his hand, not beckoning, not waving, just existing there, watching her with quiet pride. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence between them was enough. And then, as if the dream itself was breathing out, he faded, leaving only the whisper of wind and the faint outline of a smile she could still feel even after waking. When morning came, everything was blanketed in soft blue light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world so still it felt sacred. The sky stretched endlessly, pale and pure, and the air was so clear it shimmered. Lena walked outside and stood barefoot on the snow for a moment, her breath curling in front of her. The cold bit gently at her feet, reminding her she was alive. She whispered a thank you, though she wasn't sure to whom. Maybe the cabin, maybe the spirit that lingered, maybe just the world itself. She began to live each day as if it were an offering. She cooked slow meals, using the last of her supplies, soups that simmered for hours, bread baked in the old stone oven that filled the air with warmth and memory. She learned to listen more deeply. The sound of icicles dripping when the sun reached them. The call of distant birds returning as the days slowly began to lengthen. The way her heart would pause, just slightly, before each breath of wonder. There were moments of deep reflection, too. Times when she would sit and let herself feel everything that had been locked away, the losses, the noise of the city, the endless scrolling and striving that had once filled her life. She let it all rise, like snow melting into water, and when it was done, she felt lighter. The cabin had become her confessional, her sanctuary, her teacher. In its silence, she had remembered how to simply exist. One afternoon, she found an old tin box hidden behind the logs by the fireplace. It was rusted and cold to the touch, but inside, carefully folded, was a letter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but she could still make out the words. It was from her grandfather to her grandmother, written long before she was born. The letter spoke of the first winter he had spent here alone, building the porch, waiting for spring, missing her. He wrote about how the wind at night sometimes sounded like her laughter, and how he would leave the porch light burning so she could find her way home. Lena read it twice, her eyes misting. Then she folded it back and placed it on the mantel, whispering, the light's still on. That night, she lit the old lantern she had found weeks ago and set it on the porch, just as he had done. The glow spread across the snow, soft and golden, cutting through the cold darkness. She watched it from inside, the flame flickering like a heartbeat in the night. And somehow, she knew that she was no longer alone. The cabin, the mountain, the past, they were all here, surrounding her in quiet companionship. The following morning, the air carried a new scent, faint pine mixed with the sweetness of thawing earth. The first sign that winter was beginning to yield. She could feel it in her bones, the gentle shift, the promise of something just beyond the frost. She stepped outside and stood on the porch her grandfather had built, the wood creaking softly beneath her. The world was still mostly white, but there were hints of green pushing through the snow. The forest was waking. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The breeze touched her face, and she imagined it carrying whispers, stories older than her, older than the cabin, carried down from peaks that had seen countless winters come and go. She thought of how the mountains never hurried, how they allowed everything to unfold in its own time. Maybe that was the lesson she had come here to learn. That peace isn't something you chase. It's something you notice, something that has always been waiting quietly for you to stop running. She stayed a few more days, watching the transformation of the land. Each morning, more birds arrived. Each night, the stars felt closer. She didn't know when she would leave, or if she ever really would. The cabin had become part of her, and she had become part of it. On her last night there, she left the lantern burning again on the porch. The light flickered in the distance, a beacon against the cold. As she drifted to sleep, she imagined her grandparents sitting beside her, the air filled with the scent of pine and old wood, their voices gentle and calm. She dreamt of the porch, the forest, the lake, and the light all merging into one endless lullaby, carrying her deeper into rest. When she woke, the world outside was silver with dawn. The snow glowed faintly under the early light, and a soft mist rose from the trees. She stood by the window for a long time, her hands resting on the glass, watching as the first rays of sun reached the cabin. The fire had gone out during the night, but she didn't relight it. The warmth inside her didn't need it anymore. She stepped out onto the porch one last time, leaving her footprints in the snow. The light in the lantern had burned down to a faint ember, still glowing even as morning broke. She smiled, whispered a final thank you, and began her descent down the mountain. The path was bright, the air alive, and behind her, the cabin stood quietly, a keeper of peace, a witness to her becoming. And in that silence, as the world woke around her, it felt as though the mountains themselves were exhaling. She began to live each day as if it were an offering. She cooked slow meals, using the last of her supplies, soups that simmered for hours, bread baked in the old stone oven that filled the air with warmth and memory. She learned to listen more deeply. The sound of icicles dripping when the sun reached them. The call of distant birds returning as the days slowly began to lengthen. The way her heart would pause, just slightly, before each breath of wonder. There were moments of deep reflection, too. Times when she would sit and let herself feel everything that had been locked away, the losses, the noise of the city, the endless scrolling and striving that had once filled her life. She let it all rise, like snow melting into water, and when it was done, she felt lighter. The cabin had become her confessional, her sanctuary, her teacher. In its silence, she had remembered how to simply exist. One afternoon, She found an old tin box hidden behind the logs by the fireplace. It was rusted and cold to the touch, but inside, carefully folded, was a letter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but she could still make out the words. It was from her grandfather to her grandmother, written long before she was born. The letter spoke of the first winter he had spent here alone, building the porch, waiting for spring, missing her. He wrote about how the wind at night sometimes sounded like her laughter, and how he would leave the porch light burning so she could find her way home. Lena read it twice, her eyes misting. Then she folded it back and placed it on the mantel, whispering, "The light's still on." That night, she lit the old lantern she had found weeks ago and set it on the porch, just as he had done. The glow spread across the snow, soft and golden, cutting through the cold darkness. She watched it from inside, the flame flickering like a heartbeat in the night. And somehow, she knew that she was no longer alone. The cabin, the mountain, the past, they were all here, surrounding her in quiet companionship. The following morning, the air carried a new scent, faint pine mixed with the sweetness of thawing earth. The first sign that winter was beginning to yield. She could feel it in her bones, the gentle shift, the promise of something just beyond the frost. She stepped outside and stood on the porch her grandfather had built, the wood creaking softly beneath her. The world was still mostly white, but there were hints of green pushing through the snow. The forest was waking. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The breeze touched her face, and she imagined it carrying whispers, stories older than her, older than the cabin, carried down from peaks that had seen countless winters come and go. She thought of how the mountains never hurried, how they allowed everything to unfold in its own time. Maybe that was the lesson she had come here to learn. That peace isn't something you chase. It's something you notice, something that has always been waiting quietly for you to stop running. She stayed a few more days, watching the transformation of the land. Each morning, more birds arrived. Each night, the stars felt closer. She didn't know when she would leave, or if she ever really would. The cabin had become part of her, and she had become part of it. On her last night there, she left the lantern burning again on the porch. The light flickered in the distance, a beacon against the cold. As she drifted to sleep, she imagined her grandparents sitting beside her, the air filled with the scent of pine and old wood, their voices gentle and calm. She dreamt of the porch, the forest, the lake, and the light all merging into one endless lullaby, carrying her deeper into rest. When she woke, the world outside was silver with dawn. The snow glowed faintly under the early light, and a soft mist rose from the trees. She stood by the window for a long time, her hands resting on the glass, watching as the first rays of sun reached the cabin. The fire had gone out during the night, but she didn't relight it. The warmth inside her didn't need it anymore. She stepped out onto the porch one last time, leaving her footprints in the snow. The light in the lantern had burned down to a faint ember, still glowing even as morning broke. She smiled, whispered a final thank you, and began her descent down the mountain. The path was bright, the air alive, and behind her, the cabin stood quietly, a keeper of peace, a witness to her becoming. And in that silence, as the world woke around her, it felt as though the mountains themselves were exhaling. Years passed, though in Lena's memory, time didn't quite move forward. It folded gently around that winter, like pages pressed together in a favorite book. She returned to the rhythm of ordinary life, but it was slower now, deliberate, as if the mountains had taught her to breathe differently. City noise no longer startled her. It only reminded her of how quiet true peace could be. She lived in a small apartment with sunlight streaming through tall windows, and though she was surrounded by people, there were moments when she felt the same hush she had found in that cabin. Every evening, she made tea the same way she had on those snowy nights, a simple ritual that anchored her to that calm. Sometimes, as steam curled upward, she could almost smell the wood smoke again, faintly sweet and dry, and feel the mountain air brushing against her cheeks. The city outside would fade, replaced by the soft sound of wind through pines and the faint creak of wooden beams settling against the cold. The memory wasn't just a thought, it was a presence, something living that walked beside her. She often dreamed of the porch. In her dreams, it was always dusk. The snow reflected the last traces of sunlight, and the world shimmered in that in-between color that exists only for a few breaths before night. She'd be sitting on the steps, wrapped in a blanket, her breath visible in the cooling air. From somewhere deep within the forest came the familiar hum, a sound she could never name, but always knew. In those dreams, she never turned around to look at the cabin, yet she could feel its warmth, its glow, like a hand resting gently on her shoulder. One autumn, years later, Lena found herself driving west again. She hadn't planned it. She'd been attending a conference, and on the final day, something stirred within her, a whisper, a pull, a reminder. The road curved into the mountains, the air thinning, the colors deepening. Golden leaves clung to branches, trembling with the first hints of frost. She rolled down her window and let the wind touch her face, the same way it had once done years ago. There was a quiet ache in her chest, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from remembering something pure. When she reached the base of the trail, the world felt untouched. The snow hadn't yet fallen that season, but the scent of it hung in the air, waiting. The trees leaned inward, forming an archway of branches, and she began to walk. Her boots crunched on the gravel path, each step measured, familiar. She hadn't been here in so long, yet her body remembered every turn, every slope, every breath. The air grew colder as she climbed, until she could see her breath again, small clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. By the time she reached the clearing, the sun was setting. The light filtered through the trees, soft and golden, painting everything in quiet fire. And there it was, the cabin. It stood just as she remembered, a little weathered, a little older, but strong and still. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Someone was here. For a long time, she simply watched from the edge of the clearing, her heart beating slowly. Then she walked forward, the snow whispering under her steps. When she reached the porch, she saw it, the old lantern, glowing gently in the dusk. She smiled, tears filling her eyes before she even understood why. The door creaked open before she could knock. A man stood there, older, wrapped in a thick sweater, his eyes kind and startled in the same moment. "I thought this place was empty," he said softly. "It was," Lena replied, her voice calm, almost distant. But maybe it never really was. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the forest breathe. He told her he was the caretaker now, that the cabin had been restored by the town as a historical place, a tribute to the craftsmen who built it. Her grandfather's name still hung above the doorway, carved deep into the wood. The caretaker said people came sometimes, seeking quiet, seeking something they couldn't name. "They say it feels peaceful," he added, looking out toward the trees. Lena smiled. "It always has." She stepped inside, and time folded again. Everything was as she remembered, the same creak of the floorboards, the same scent of pine and smoke, the same stillness that wrapped around her like a familiar song. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, the grain of the wood smooth under her touch. She moved to the fireplace, and there it was, her grandfather's old tools hanging neatly, and beside them, her own journal, preserved behind a small pane of glass. The caretaker said they'd found it years ago, left open on the table. "People like to read it," he said. "It helps them sleep, I think." She laughed softly, a tear rolling down her cheek. "It helped me live." As night fell, she sat on the porch again, the caretaker leaving her alone with the mountain. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of snow about to fall. The lantern's glow wavered, and she watched it, mesmerized, her breath sinking with its flicker. The forest whispered the way it always had, not words, but something beyond them, something the heart could hear. She whispered back, "I came home." The first snowflake landed on her hand. She held it there, watching as it melted against her warmth. Then another fell, and another, until the air was filled with slow, drifting silver. The forest faded into white, and the world became small again, just her, the porch, and the soft hush of snow returning to where it belonged. She stayed until the moon rose above the ridge, casting a silver sheen across the trees. When she finally stood, her body felt light, her heart steady. She turned to look at the cabin one last time. The lantern was still burning, steady as ever. Driving down the mountain the next morning, the sun glinting off frost-tipped branches, Lena didn't feel sadness. She felt complete. The cabin no longer called to her, it didn't need to. It had given her what she came for, and she carried it with her now. Peace wasn't a place after all. It was a way of being. And somewhere high above the valley, in that small clearing surrounded by endless snow, the porch light of the winter cabin in Colorado continued to glow. It waited not for her, but for the next weary traveler who needed to remember how to rest. For the next soul who would find, in its quiet warmth, that the world is still full of kindness. When the night wind brushed across the lake or the forest whispered under moonlight, it carried the softest echo, a lullaby without words, one that drifted down the mountain and into dreams. It spoke of stillness, of love that outlives time, of warmth that never truly fades. And if you listened long enough, you could almost hear it, the gentle creak of a wooden porch, a lantern flickering in the dark, and a woman's laughter mingling with the snow. Years after that night on the porch, the winters came and went in a rhythm that Lena could almost feel in her bones. Each snowfall seemed to carry a message she had once understood, though the words had faded with time. Still, every so often, she would wake before dawn, pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and imagine the soft, steady glow of that cabin lantern flickering through the snow. The sound of the city outside, buses, footsteps, sirens, would fade until only the whisper of the wind against her window remained. It was strange, she often thought, how the most peaceful places never truly leave us. They settle somewhere quiet inside, like a memory that hums softly beneath the noise of everyday life. Sometimes she would see something small, a wooden bench in a park, a wisp of breath in cold air, the way frost formed delicate stars on glass, and she would feel as if she were there again, sitting on that porch with the world made simple by silence. In time, Lena began writing again, not the hurried kind she used to do for work, but the kind that came like breathing slow, unhurried, tender. Her stories were calm, full of snow and stillness, of lanterns burning in faraway cabins. She didn't write to be read, she wrote to remember. But somehow, her stories found their way to others through online posts, readings, and whispers shared between strangers who couldn't sleep. People began writing to her, saying her words made them feel at peace, that they felt as though they had visited that same cabin she wrote about, even if they didn't know where it stood. Lena never corrected them. She just smiled and wrote back, "Maybe you did." As years folded gently into one another, the cabin became something of a legend in that small part of Colorado. Locals spoke of it in a half-whisper, saying it brought good dreams to those who stayed there, that if you arrived burdened with sorrow, you would leave a little lighter. Some said the light in the window never went out, even when the snow was thick and the roads were closed. Others swore they'd heard soft laughter drifting from the porch when no one was there. One year, a young man named Eli found himself driving into those same mountains. He had no particular destination, just a need to be far from everything familiar. The world he'd known had grown too loud, too fast, and though he didn't know it, he was searching for the same thing Lena once had. The snow began to fall heavily, his tires crunching through the winding road until his headlights caught the glint of a frozen sign, the Winter Cabin Trail. He parked by instinct, drawn to the name. The wind bit against his face as he began the walk upward, his breath sharp and white. The silence was vast, unbroken except for the steady whisper of snow landing on branches. There was something comforting in that quiet, something that reached deeper than words. He felt watched, not by eyes, but by memory, as if the trees themselves carried stories. By the time he reached the clearing, dusk was closing in. The cabin stood waiting, the lantern still glowing softly by the door. Eli paused, a strange sense of belonging settling over him. It was as though someone had been expecting him. When he opened the door, the air inside was warm, the fire already burning. A pot sat on the stove, steam curling upward. There was a blanket folded neatly on the chair, and above the mantel, a framed photograph of a woman he didn't know. Her face was kind, her expression calm, her eyes carrying that same knowing gentleness the mountains held. Beneath the photo, a small plaque read, "For those who seek quiet, may you find it here." Eli stood there for a long time, not questioning how the fire had been lit or who had left the food. He simply sat down, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around him like an embrace. He pulled the journal from the table and began to read. It was filled with entries, some old and faded, others written in newer ink. The handwriting changed over the years, but the message was always the same. It spoke of peace, of snow, of the stillness that heals. Outside, the storm deepened, snow swirling in thick white ribbons. Eli stayed by the fire, reading until his eyelids grew heavy. Just before sleep took him, he thought he heard footsteps on the porch, slow, careful, familiar. The door didn't open, but the sound remained, as if someone had paused there to listen. When he woke the next morning, sunlight poured through the frosted window. The storm had passed. He stepped outside, the world glistening under a fresh layer of snow. Everything was silent except for the gentle creak of the trees. Turning back toward the cabin, he noticed something new on the railing, a small wooden carving, smooth and freshly made, of a lantern. It hadn't been there the night before. He held it in his gloved hands, smiling without understanding why. Then he placed it carefully back where he found it. That night, before leaving, he added his own words to the journal. He wrote about the calm he'd felt, the way the silence had filled him with warmth. He wrote that he hadn't known peace could sound like snow falling. And when he left, he placed the pen neatly beside the book, just as the entries before his had done. From that day forward, others came, travelers, writers, dreamers, and those whose hearts had grown tired. Each left something behind, a story, a note, a sketch, a small token on the porch. And through all the seasons, through every frost and thaw, the cabin remained. The lantern continued to burn, its soft golden glow guiding those who wandered too far from peace. Sometimes, late at night, when the moonlight spilled across the snow and the world held its breath, a shape could be seen sitting quietly on the porch, a woman, her hair touched by silver, her face serene. She would gaze out over the mountains, listening to the wind move through the trees, before fading gently with the dawn. It was said that the cabin belonged to her spirit now, not as a ghost, but as a guardian of rest. She waited there for the weary, the lost, the sleepless, offering them what the world often forgot to give: silence, warmth, and the reminder that they were safe. And so, when the snow begins to fall and the mountains turn white under the stars, there are those who swear that if you drive far enough, if you listen close enough, you can still find it: the winter cabin in Colorado. The lantern burns there still, its glow reaching quietly through the trees, calling those who need it most. It doesn't ask for names or reasons. It only whispers what every tired soul longs to hear: rest now. You've come home. The legend of the winter cabin grew quietly, not through advertisements or travel blogs, but through whispers that passed between people who needed peace. A woman in Chicago once told her sister about a dream she had: a cabin in the snow, where a fire burned low and soft music played though no one was there to play it. A man who had lost his way after years of chasing success found himself driving west without a destination, guided only by a strange pull he couldn't explain. He never told anyone how he ended up in Colorado, or how he found the cabin sitting silent beneath the stars, but when he came home, people noticed the difference in him. He spoke slower. He smiled easier. When asked where he'd been, he only said, "Somewhere quiet." The years blended together, the cabin remaining unchanged even as the world rushed forward. The trees surrounding it grew taller, the lake nearby freezing and thawing with each passing season, always catching the light of the lantern in its mirrored surface. No matter how much time passed, that light never went out. It glowed steadily against the dark, a small, constant reminder that peace was not something lost, only something waiting to be found. Sometimes hikers discovered it by accident. They would be caught in a sudden snowstorm, unable to see beyond the veil of white, until that golden flicker appeared ahead like a promise. They'd knock on the door hesitantly, expecting it to be locked or abandoned, but it would always open. Inside, they would find warmth, the kind that felt alive, not just from the fire, but from something deeper. On the mantel, the old journal still rested, its pages filled with hundreds of different handwritings. There were notes from strangers, stories from long ago, and even sketches of the landscape outside. Each page seemed to hold a different piece of the same truth, that silence could heal, and that sometimes the world spoke loudest when it said nothing at all. The cabin didn't belong to anyone, not anymore. It belonged to the weary, the seekers, the ones who didn't realize how tired they were until they felt the calm of its walls. People began calling it the resting place. It wasn't an official name, but it fit. And though no map marked its exact location, travelers continued to find it, guided by intuition, memory, or fate. One autumn evening, years after Eli had left his message in the journal, a woman named Clara came to the cabin. She was a musician who had lost her love for music after too many years of touring, of applause that no longer filled her heart. She came to the mountains seeking silence, hoping it might remind her what sound used to mean. When she arrived, the lantern was already glowing, and she felt the familiar weight of snow in the air. She stepped inside, brushing frost from her hair, and instantly felt a calm she hadn't known in years. There was a chair near the fire, worn smooth by countless visitors before her. She sat down and opened the journal. The entries were full of warmth, confessions, gratitude, small moments of grace written by people from everywhere. One page caught her eye. If you're reading this, I hope you stay a little while. Don't rush. The world can wait. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant, as if the person who wrote it had learned patience from the mountains themselves. Clara smiled faintly and stayed. For 3 days, she didn't play a single note. She walked through the forest, listened to the quiet hum of the wind between the trees, and let the rhythm of the snowfall slow her thoughts. On the 4th morning, she found an old guitar leaning against the wall, its strings dusty, but still strong. She tuned it slowly, feeling the vibrations through her fingertips, and began to play. The melody was soft and uncertain at first, but soon it became steady, round, like a voice remembering how to sing. The notes floated through the cabin, gentle as falling snow. They filled the air with something sacred and healing. When she finished, she placed the guitar back and added her own note to the journal. For those who forget their music, it's waiting here for you, just like everything else. When she left, the sound of her song seemed to linger, mingling with the wind. Visitors who came after swore they could sometimes hear faint music in the distance when the night was still enough, not from any instrument, but from the air itself. As time went on, the journal grew thicker. It became less of a log and more of a shared soul, a living collection of stories and small acts of kindness left behind by strangers who never met. There were letters written to lost loved ones, sketches of the sunrise over the lake, poems written in shaky hands. Some entries were no longer legible, ink washed away by melted snow or tears, but even those faint marks carried meaning. And through all of it, the lantern continued to burn. It didn't matter how fierce the wind became or how heavy the snow fell, it never went out. There was no electricity, no visible source of fuel, but no one questioned it. They accepted it the same way they accepted the warmth of the fire or the comfort of the bed. Some said the lantern was kept alive by the collective peace of everyone who had ever found rest there. Others said it was the spirit of the woman in the photograph, still keeping watch over the weary. One particularly cold winter, a storm swept through the mountains stronger than any in decades. Trees bent under the weight of snow, and the trails vanished completely. The towns below believed the cabin would finally be lost, buried under ice and time. But when the storm cleared days later, a hiker traveling through that region saw a glimmer far off in the white distance, a small, steady light, burning as if untouched. He never reached it that day, but he told the story to others. And soon, the legend of the winter cabin in Colorado became more than just a tale. It became a promise. People began leaving lanterns on their porches in the middle of winter, in honor of the unseen place that gave peace to those who sought it. Some even swore that when they lit their lanterns on a snowy night, They could feel a presence nearby, a hush, a warmth, the echo of soft footsteps on wooden floors. Somewhere high in those silent mountains, the cabin still waits, unchanged and eternal. The journal still lies open, a pen beside it, ready for another hand to add a line. The air still smells faintly of pine and firewood. And if you listen closely enough, past the whisper of snow and the quiet of the lake, you might just hear a voice, calm, tender, and timeless, saying, "You're safe here. Rest now. You've found your way home." The years stretched on, and the world changed in ways the cabin never could. Roads turned to highways, letters turned to screens, and the silence that once filled evenings was replaced by the hum of constant connection. Yet, far beyond the reach of cell towers and headlights, the cabin stood untouched, waiting in its gentle patience. The wind carried whispers through the pines, whispers that felt almost like voices, echoes of those who had once found peace there. They lingered, not as ghosts, but as warmth that never quite faded. Sometimes, when the moon was full and silver light fell across the frozen lake, the cabin would seem to breathe. The walls, soaked with stories and sleep, would hold the faintest tremor of laughter. A soft creak from the rocking chair, a long sigh from the chimney, as though the place itself remembered everyone who had ever needed it. And perhaps it did. Perhaps, in the quiet, the cabin was not just shelter, but memory. Travelers still came, though not as many as before. Some found their way by accident, some by instinct, and a rare few through the words left behind in the journal. One evening, a young teacher named Michael stumbled upon those words online. He had been reading late into the night, searching for something he couldn't name. The story of a cabin in the mountains, of strangers finding comfort in silence, caught him in a way nothing else had. It felt real, too vivid to be fiction. There were coordinates in one of the comments, rough and uncertain, but enough to spark something inside him. So one winter, he packed a small bag, left his phone behind, and drove west. The further he went, the quieter everything became. The sky widened, the air thinned, and the noise of life faded into a simple rhythm of tires on snow. When his car could go no further, he continued on foot, guided only by the faint outline of a trail half buried under white. His breath made clouds in the air, and his steps crunched softly, like whispers in the stillness. He didn't know if he would find the cabin, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a hurry. The light appeared just as the last bit of sun slipped behind the peaks. It was soft and golden, like a candle glowing behind frosted glass. When he reached it, he saw the cabin exactly as it had been described: weathered wood, a steady lantern, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He hesitated before knocking, though part of him already knew no one would answer. When he pushed the door open, the warmth met him instantly. The fire burned low and slow, as though waiting for him. The journal sat where it always had, on the small table beside a mug that still smelled faintly of tea. He ran his hand over the cover, feeling the grooves of time pressed into the leather, and opened it. The pages were filled with words written by countless people, men, women, wanderers, dreamers, all of them leaving small pieces of themselves behind. Some wrote only a few words. "Thank you. I slept well. It's quiet here." Others wrote pages of memories, regrets, and gentle thoughts that had nowhere else to go. Each entry carried the same undercurrent of peace, like ripples moving outward from a single calm center. Michael read until his eyes grew heavy. He found a page written in faded ink that simply said, "The world keeps spinning." But here it doesn't have to. He smiled faintly, letting the sound of the crackling fire lull him. He slept deeper that night than he had in years, dreaming of snow falling endlessly across an untouched valley. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the window, and for a moment, he thought he could hear someone humming softly from the porch. He stepped outside, half expecting to see another traveler, but there was no one there. Only the snow, the lake, and a single pair of footprints that weren't his, leading from the edge of the porch into the trees. They disappeared a few yards in, fading into the frost. He followed them a short distance before they vanished completely. It didn't frighten him. Instead, it filled him with a strange peace, as if whoever had been there was simply moving on, back into the stillness where they belonged. He spent the day wandering the forest, letting the silence stretch around him like a blanket. When he returned, he took the journal and added his own entry. He wrote about how he'd found the cabin, about how the world outside felt too loud, and how, in this quiet place, he'd finally remembered what it meant to breathe. At the end, he added one more line: "For whoever finds this next, don't rush back. The noise can wait. The world will still be there when you return." When he closed the book, he noticed a small carving on the windowsill, the shape of a bird, its wings slightly open as if about to take flight. The edges were smooth, newly made. He hadn't seen it before, and it hadn't been mentioned in any entry. He touched it gently, feeling its delicate curve, and smiled. He didn't take it with him. He left it there, where the morning light could touch it. That night, he stayed by the fire, listening to the quiet. There was something about the way the flames moved, steady and unhurried, that made him feel like time itself had stopped. The snow outside fell silently, wrapping the cabin in white. And as the hours passed, the lines between dreaming and waking blurred. He thought he saw a faint silhouette move past the window, a woman, calm and graceful, pausing as if to listen. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He felt only warmth. By morning, the storm had ended, and the cabin seemed brighter than before. When Michael left, he looked back once more at the light in the window, still glowing steadily against the snow. It felt alive, eternal. He didn't tell anyone about his visit when he returned home. Some places, he thought, are meant to be found only by those who need them. Over the years, he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and feel as though he could still smell the pine smoke, still hear the hush of falling snow. In the quiet between waking and sleep, he would picture the cabin, the journal, the soft glow of the lantern. And somewhere deep in his heart, he knew it was still there, waiting, watching, welcoming the next traveler who needed to rest. In the stillness of winter, when the world slows just enough to listen, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of peace carried on the wind, the echo of laughter long gone, and the soft creak of a rocking chair under the weight of memory. Somewhere out there, the lantern still burns. Somewhere, the fire still warms the hands of someone who has finally found home. As the winters passed and the mountains folded themselves deeper into silence, the cabin remained untouched, unchanged, eternal. Snow fell heavier some years, storms came and went, trees bowed under white blankets, and still the lantern glowed. Its light never dimmed, never flickered, never failed. It wasn't bright, not the kind of light that cut through darkness, but soft, a light that soothed rather than revealed, a light that waited. And so it was that the winter cabin became less a place and more a feeling, one that lived quietly in the hearts of those who had found it. Michael often thought of it as he grew older. He would catch the scent of pine in summer, or hear the hush of rain, and feel a calm settle deep within him, the kind that didn't need to be named. He never returned, though sometimes he dreamed he had, and in those dreams, the snow always fell the same way, slow and soundless, the cabin always waiting, the lantern always burning. Some nights, he would wake in the quiet hours before dawn, the city outside still asleep, and he would think he heard the crackle of that same fire. He would lie still, listening to the rhythm of his breath, and the world would feel smaller, gentler, more forgiving. He understood then what the others had written in that journal. Peace doesn't leave you when you go. It follows quietly, a silent companion that reminds you to rest, to breathe, to remember that stillness is not absence, it is presence. Far away, in the cold of another winter, a new traveler made their way up the mountain trail. The footprints of others had long been buried by time, but the path still knew the way. The air was crisp, the snow shimmering beneath a pale moon, and the forest whispered softly as if welcoming them. When the traveler reached the clearing, the sight was the same as it had always been, the cabin standing in quiet grace, the warm glow spilling through the window, the smoke curling gently into the night sky. The traveler paused, feeling the same pull that had brought so many before. They stepped onto the porch, brushing the snow from their shoulders, and when they opened the door, the warmth greeted them as though it had been waiting. The fire was already burning. The chair still rocked faintly by the hearth. And there, on the table, rested the journal, older now, its pages yellowed at the edges, its spine cracked from the weight of so many hands. The traveler sat and began to read, the sound of the pages soft as breath. As they turned each page, the cabin seemed to exhale, a slow, content sigh that filled the air with calm. The stories within spoke not of endings, but of continuance. Each entry was a thread, and together they formed something whole, something alive. When the traveler finally reached the last page, they saw a line written in neat, steady handwriting. To whoever finds this next, keep the light burning. Someone someday will need it too. The traveler smiled, closing the book gently. They added their own words beneath it, nothing elaborate, just gratitude. Then they rose, fed another log into the fire, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow was still falling, endless and serene, the mountains stretching out like sleeping giants under a sky full of stars. They looked back once more at the glow in the window, then lifted their hand in a silent farewell. When the door closed, the cabin settled again into its quiet rhythm. The lantern flickered softly, its flame bending and dancing in the cold air, casting its golden hue across the room. Outside, the forest hummed, the wind carrying whispers through the trees, voices that belong to no one and everyone all at once. And so it continues. The world turns, the snow falls, the travelers come and go. But the winter cabin in Colorado remains, its light steadfast and gentle, calling out across the mountains to those who have forgotten what stillness feels like. It doesn't demand, doesn't beckon. It simply waits. Somewhere out there, in the deep hush of winter, a soul will hear that call, a faint echo in the cold, a warmth that stirs the heart, and they will follow it through the falling snow until the lantern's glow greets them too. And when they finally rest their head beneath that old wooden roof, the cabin will do what it has always done. It will listen. It will shelter. It will remind them, as softly as the whisper of wind through pine, you are safe now. The world can wait. Rest.
And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close, but your night continues calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest. For the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000/.